Hi, my name is Marie Doucette, and I would like to talk to you today about the history of special education in the United States. This picture was taken at Hartford, Connecticut at the American School for the Deaf. The opening of this school is important to the history of special education because before schools for the deaf were opened, children with severe difficulties hearing often were not educated. This is a picture of Samuel Gridley Howe. He was an educator at the New England Institution for the Education of the Blind in Massachusetts. Schools for the blind allowed children with visual impairments to be educated when they had previously not been, making them very important to the history of special education in the United States. Dorothea Dix is pictured here. She was the one person I will talk about that didn't have a government, school, or group affiliation. I feel she is important to the history of special education in the United States because she was a strong advocate for people with disabilities, and her talks managed to open the eyes of others, enabling them to see past the disability and see a person. The Council for Exceptional Children was founded by Elizabeth Farrell in 1922, and it was important to the history of special education because they have advocated for the success of children with exceptionalities since 1922, and this advocacy group still exists today. The ARC is another advocacy group for children with exceptionalities that exists today. They became important in the history of special education for their work to educate about intellectual disabilities during a time when little was known about them. I found this important because when my son was diagnosed with ADHD, learning about ADHD helped me to better understand the educational needs of my child. Legal actions are an important part of the history of special education. The first one I'm going to talk about is the Training of Professional Personnel Act. I included this event because I think that training educators how to work with students with different needs to achieve educational goals is important. This shows our first step towards equality in education in the United States. Here is a picture of President Johnson signing the Elementary and Secondary Education Act. This event is an important event in the history of special education in the United States because it shows the U.S. is in an era that was concerned about civil rights of the people, and this includes civil rights of people with exceptionalities. Park versus Commonwealth is an important court case in the history of special education because it connected the rights of every child with disabilities to the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment of the Constitution. This shows our country moving towards equality of rights for people with exceptionalities by protection of their rights under the U.S. Constitution. Section 504 of the Rehabilitation Act of 1973 is a national protection law from discrimination based on disability. The recognition of rights of children with disabilities are an important addition to the history of special education because it states equality must be applied to all people. The Education for All Handicapped Children Act has been amended many times and eventually becomes IDEA. And it is important to the history of special education because it grants equal access to education to all students. To me, this is the first sign that equality is being implemented in the United States. The Handicapped Children Protection Act amends the Education for All Handicapped Children Act. This act is important to the history of special education because the amendments concerning parent involvement and legal recourse are shaping the current form of IDEA. In this amendment to IDEA, this adds transition plans for employment. The reason this is important to the history of special education is because it recognizes the need for life skills and help training for employment for children with exceptionalities. The No Child Left Behind Act requires children to be tested to measure their achievement, making sure that teachers are held accountable for students to become proficient in math and reading. The Individuals with Disabilities Improvement Act expands further on the ideas of IDEA. It is important to the history of special education because it expands further and becomes the building blocks of our current IDEA. The R Word campaign has nothing to do with education per se, but I believe that this campaign is important to include with the history of special education because it's important for children to go to school in an environment where they feel safe and free from verbal bullying. And it kind of shows the change that we're making in the United States. The American Recovery and Reinvestment Act involves funding for IDEA. I think this act is important to the history of special education because it involves funding for special education programs, including children ages 3 through 5, and funding is required to keep these special education programs running. So it's very, very important. So what are my predictions for 20 years into the future for special education? There's always room for improvement that can be made as society changes. I find looking at the past and how far we've come very encouraging. From advocacy in the early days of U.S. history of special education to the legislation passed, we see an environment of inclusion for all children starting to emerge. I see good things in the future for students with special education programs.